And speaking of being black, it should be understood there's not one way to be black. Africa is the second biggest continent in the world. You can squeeze China, India, the USA, and most of Europe into it at the same time. It has a huge array of different climates and environments, ranging from rainforest to Sahel to desert to regular forest to savanna to snow capped mountains. And people have lived throughout these regions for millennia. Africans have lived on this continent for almost 300,000 years and have had constant migrations from west to east, from east to west, from south to north, and every which way you can think of. There's no one trait that defines an African. We have the tallest people in the world, and we have the shortest people in the world. We have different hair textures, different skin tones. Some people are really muscular, some people are really skinny and lean. We have a lot of diversity amongst our populations. For example, physical features like the nose per se. There are three types of nose shape. One is a narrow nasal aperture, which usually results in a long, straight nose. One is a wide nasal aperture, which results in a wider and more round nose. And lastly, there's a more heart-shaped nasal aperture that is sort of in between the two. All three of these nasal apertures are native to Africa and arose in the human species before human beings even migrated out of Africa. They're a result of environmental adaptation native to Africa and are seen throughout the continent. One is not more African than the other. For example, let's look at these ancient Nigerian sculptures. This is a bust from Ife, and you can see this gentleman does not have a fat, round nose. He has a straight aquiline nose. He has a prominent bridge, giving it the appearance of being curved or slightly bent. The term aquiline comes from the Latin aquilinus, or eagle-like, an allusion to the curved beak of an eagle. This is another piece from Nigeria. As we can see, she has the more heart-shaped nasal aperture, neither very narrow or very wide. This is another bust of a Yoruba queen. She has a wider nasal aperture. This is another piece, once again, prominent bridge, narrow nasal aperture. Here's another great masterwork of Nigerian sculpture, one of my favorites, once again, wider nasal aperture. And finally, here's another one, a terracotta piece, and this individual once again has a heart-shaped nasal aperture. All of these statues represent the actual diversity of African features you'll find in West Africa, as well as throughout the continent. All of these people are native Nigerians. There's no one homogeneous feature that defines blackness. So whether you're looking at Rakim or Tupac or Big Daddy Kane or KRS-One, they're all black. KRS-One isn't more black because he has a round nose. All of these features are native to Africa. You see a lot of straight bridges and narrow nasal apertures around regions like Ethiopia or Eastern Africa. That's because a narrow nasal aperture is caused by cold temperatures. In hotter regions, a wider nose is better suited from an evolutionary standpoint, as it allows for more oxygen to reach the brain to cool it down. Where it's the exact opposite in colder regions. An excess amount of air will cause the brain to freeze or overcool. So the nasal aperture is thinner. In the highlands of Ethiopia, it's very cold. It's alpine weather, and the air is very thin. The Ethiopians are so well adapted to that region and that high altitude climate, they have a number of genetic adaptations that make them immune to hypoxia, which is caused by a lack of oxygen. To quote Gatto et al., native Amara Highlanders showed no indication of chronic mountain sickness and had a higher pulmonary blood pressure without having a higher pulmonary vascular resistance. In addition, the cerebral circulation is sensitive to nitrogen oxide and carbon dioxide, but not to hypoxia, which would likely promote increased cerebral blood flow and increase oxygen to the brain, making Ethiopian high-altitude natives better suited for survival at high altitude. Early research has revealed that because of the presence of long-term adaptive mechanisms, lowlanders can strive and live permanently at altitudes of up to 49,000 miles, whereas a native Highlander can reside at a maximum altitude of 58,000 to 60,000 miles. Ethiopian people have been living in these conditions for millennia. For instance, the Simien mountain regions are one of the only places in Africa where it regularly snows. As we saw, lowlanders have these same adaptations as well. This is why so many Ethiopians and Somalians have that very straight, thin nose. There are skeletons that are 10 to 12,000 years old from Gambel's Cave in East Africa with that same phenotypic adaptation, that thin face with a very narrow nasal aperture. That is a native African adaptation. While a straight nose is designed for cold temperatures, a wide nose is designed for the exact opposite. While a thin nose will keep your brain from freezing, a broad nose will help your brain from overheating, and you can get more oxygen to the brain. The wider the nostrils, the broader the nasal aperture, the more oxygen. This is why in places like Congo or Nubia or Upper Egypt, they have very broad nasal apertures. In Upper Egypt, it can get as hot as 120 degrees, so a lot of Nubians have very broad noses. This is Muhammad Ramadan, one of the most famous actors in Egypt. And you can see he has a really broad nose. If you go to Egypt, Nubians will actually tell you that too.
We are pharaohs here. Pharaohs, all of them, they are black. Look at the figure. Look at the nose and his lips. And they black top shimmering. They are black. Imagine about this climate. I live in this climate. How I become dusky color? According to my climate.
Yes.
How Germans and British become white? Because frozen cold. They become white, and thin nose. I have wide nose to get more oxygen in extremely hot climate. In summer, it's increased here to 50 degrees. Thin nose cannot collect oxygen.
In general, this is why you see a lot of broad noses on ancient Egyptian statues. The first pharaohs of Egypt are from the Sudan. For example, this is Pharaoh Narmer, first pharaoh of Egypt. He has a very broad nasal aperture. This is Pharaoh Ninjar, and as you can see as well, very broad nasal aperture, very full lips. There are countless amounts of statues that look just like this. Here's the actual hieroglyphic for face in ancient Egypt, and you can see, once again, very wide nasal aperture, very broad nose. You also see a lot of pronounced prognathicism in ancient Egyptian statues. This is a trait found heavily throughout Africa. It's almost non-existent in other groups. It's where your upper maxilla protrudes beyond the plane of your face. It can make the lips look very full. A good example is Nina Simone, who's a genius and a goddess, and she has very pronounced prognathicism of the upper maxilla. Do all black people have prognathicism? No, you can have little to no prognathicism and still be black. Like Lupita Nyong'o doesn't really have much prognathicism. Here's a statue of Pharaoh Huni. Very wide nasal aperture, pronounced prognathicism, and those slanted almond eyes we talked about earlier. That's very common amongst Africans. Here's a painting of Amenhotep III, very pronounced prognathicism. Here's another statue. Even though the nose is broken off, you can still see the whole shape of the nose, see the prognathicism, and see that wide nasal aperture. Because Upper Egypt is so hot and a lot of native Nubians have this phenotype, you see a lot of broken noses by the French, by the British, by the Americans, by the Germans, by the Italians. These people also went into Sudan and broke the tops off the pyramids there. It's really funny in retrospect, because did they really think breaking the nose off would hide their ethnic identity? You can still very much see it's a black guy. You can see the whole shape and size and contours of the nose, the full lips, the prognathicism, the slanted almond-shaped eyes. We know what a black person looks like, even if you break the nose off. Anyone can recognize general African facial morphology. This type of colonial defacement is why people have such an incorrect idea about Egypt and Africa. Europeans created a slew of myths and lies to destroy any semblance of African civilization. One of the most heinous lies spread by white colonists is the myth that black people can't build in stone. This is usually levied at Niger-Congo people, but that's quickly proven incorrect when we actually look at what's inside of Africa, especially when we go here. Great Zimbabwe, located in South Africa and built by Bantu Niger-Congo people, the Shona, this stone-built city is almost 1,000 years old. We see massive walls, built to a grand size. The tops designed with the interlocking triangle motif. Massive conical towers, beautiful stone walkways and passages, and beautiful stone bird sculptures that used to sit on the tops of the walls. And what makes it all the more wonderful is that the entire site was built with no mortar, every stone crafted perfectly. The entrance to the great enclosure, supporting tons of weight, speaking to the engineering prowess of these early Niger-Congo people. We also see that Great Zimbabwe is built in a naturalistic state, almost like an amoeba, a very circular oval form that flows and curves with the nature around it. This is typical of Niger-Congo dry stone architecture, as this form of fractal geometry is used at several other sites. As we see, there are several circles inside the larger circle, with more circular stone buildings radiating outward. We see this same use of fractal geometry elsewhere in South Africa. Here in Mpumalanga, the ruins of ancient stone-built settlements stretch for miles and miles, carving through the hills and landscape. Built by the Koni people, also a Bantu Niger-Congo speaking people, they too employed the use of dry stone architecture to construct their ancient sites. These large dry stone ruins that stretch for miles and miles are known as the Bakoni, and they are one of the largest collections of stone-built ruins on the earth. Here in Kenya, East Africa, the same Niger-Congo dry stone building techniques can be found. This is Thimlik Ohenga, built by early Bantu peoples, bringing iron technology into East Africa. We once again find the circular fractal layouts of sites and scaled dry stone architecture. So where is the origin of this technique? Well, not surprising, as Niger-Congo people originate in West Africa, the oldest dry stone structures can be found in West Africa. Here at Tashit, the ruins of these dry stone buildings go back over 4,000 years and were built by the Soninke people. It's here we not only find the beginning of the dry stone building techniques West Africans would use as they traveled to East and South Africa, but also the beginning of that distinctive fractal organization that would define Niger-Congo dry stone architecture. This impressive style would eventually evolve into the ancient cities of the Empire of Ghana. Beautiful dry stone architecture abounds throughout West Africa. The ancient cities that once thrived during the Empire of the Ghana show fractal distinctive designs. In their motifs, triangles are represented within triangles and are reminiscent of the later decorations of Great Zimbabwe. Once again, we see that beautiful fractal design. The ruins of ancient palaces that once housed powerful West African kings can be found here. Beautiful dry stone pillars and ancient watchtowers abound in the dry stone cities of the Empire of Ghana. So we can see the myth that black people, specifically West Africans, don't build in stone is just that, a myth. West Africans are some of the oldest stonemasons on the face of the earth, and we used a distinctive dry stone architecture that was shared by Niger-Congo people as they traveled from West Africa to other regions. But it should be known that this dry stone architecture goes back more than 4,000 years. In Tashit, we find thousands of ancient tumuli. These ancient burial mounds mark the graves of the ancestors and are found throughout the Sahara and West Africa, some being simple and some being complex burial sites. It's these dry stone tumuli that serve as the predecessor to the Great Pyramids and mastaba tombs of Egypt. The earliest human burials with monumental superstructures in the Nigerian Sahara appear around 4,700 BC, 200,000 years before the Great Pyramids were built. And if we look deeper into the West African Sahara, we find the ruins of ancient cities built in that same circular fractal design that was shared by all Niger-Congo architecture. Ancient cities litter the now barren Sahara. We can see these cities were built around lush waterways. The remnants of those once bountiful bodies of water look like veins in the ancient sands. These cities are absolutely massive and illustrate an important element of the Green Sahara. That is, that these people were not simple fishermen and hunters. They were stone builders. And a whole African civilization once thrived in the oasis that was the Green Sahara. And it wasn't just elaborate tumuli that were built, but several stone monuments. Crays, skelas, keyholes, compasses, antennas, goulettes, and several other stone-built settlements are found throughout the Sahara. In that same fractal style, we find at the Bokoni, at Great Zimbabwe, at Tishit. When we compile all of these ancient stone monuments, we get a staggering amount of sites. As we proceed, it will become very clear that Africans of the Green Sahara did not only build in stone, but they had mathematics, mummification, and many of the rituals and practices that would become commonplace amongst the Egyptians. In short, the Africans that lived in the Green Sahara were the Egyptians before they moved to Egypt. The culture that defined the Green Sahara is known as the Aqualithic. Named after the aquatic environment of Africa during the Holocene, this cultural complex was defined by two distinct artifacts, that being wavy line and dotted wavy line pottery and barbed bone harpoons. This cultural complex stretches from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Nile Valley and down into East Africa. To understand the beginning of the Aqualithic culture, we have to start here in Mali, West Africa. It's here at Njugu in Mali we find the beginning of ceramic technology in Africa. It's here in Mali that these Africans would invent the oldest pottery in Africa and the second oldest pottery outside of East Asia, dating to 9,500 BC. Pottery is one of the most important technological breakthroughs in mankind's history. The pottery in Mali predates the appearance of pottery in the Levant by 4,000 years, and is most likely the source where that pottery came from, as African migrations into the Levant and Mediterranean during the Green Sahara occurred for millennia. It should be noted that historically the creation of pottery has always been the purview of West African women, their creation of ceramics being closely associated with creativity and fertility. Thus, it is to West African women we can attribute this large spread of ceramic technology. The use of pyrotechnology, the deliberate control and use of fire to transform earthenware to make pots, pans, cups, and pottery, is one of the most important inventions in African history. And many of these ancient techniques are still in use till this day.
African potters do not use kilns, but either fire on the flat ground or in a very shallow depression. Occasionally, potters will construct low circular walls in which they place their pottery, and the walls keep extra cold air from blowing into the firing. Potters use whatever fuel is available. They may use dry donkey manure, dry grass from the fields beyond their homes, dry bark that they collected while they were cutting firewood, or especially in the forest areas to the south, the dried midribs of raffia palms. They never use expensive fuels such as gas or electricity. All of the women in the community work together to pile up the new pottery in the kiln for a firing. If several women work together, each may identify her own pottery by some pattern impressed in the clay or painted with slip on the exterior. The fuel is lighted and allowed to burn freely. In Pellingham, you see some of the women throwing pails of water on the firing to try to slow down the burning so that it doesn't get too hot too rapidly. They also take care not to let the fire spread to the neighboring brush. In a short time, the fuel has been reduced to a very thick blanket of red-hot ash. The pottery bakes underneath this for some time until it is a bright glowing red. While it is still hot, the potters hook out the pottery and dip the hot pottery in a kind of vegetable soup made of boiled up acacia seed pods. This process drives excess carbon deep into the body of the hot pottery, turning the jars from a bright red to a dark brown. This is very similar to techniques used in Japan and America, which are called raku. The process makes the pottery more suitable for cooking over an open fire and makes jars more waterproof. The process turns the red ferric iron, Fe3, into black ferrous iron, Fe2.
It's these early inventors from Mali that would take their new technology deep into the central and eastern Sahara. Arriving in the Nile Valley, the tradition of dotted wavy line and wavy line pottery would come to define Sudanese culture for millennia. While some have proposed an independent invention of pottery in the Sudan, the oldest dates of the wavy line tradition can be found here in West Africa, at sites in Niger, at Timet, Arjarbous, and Taglagal, respectively. This technology quickly diffused down into East Africa as groups migrated down into Lake Turkana, bringing their new invention. A special note is the early presence of barbed bone harpoons in Kenya before the appearance of the West African ceramic tradition. The creators of pottery at Unjugu, Mali, then migrated into the Central Sahara, occupying regions of Tenere in Niger, the Air Mountains in Niger, the Caucasus Mountains in Libya, and Taglagal and Timet in Niger. It's here these groups would live for millennia. The Green Sahara would see a massive explosion of cave art during the Aqualithic. Giant galleries of art decorate shelves and cave walls throughout the Sahara, depicting the aquatic environment of the Green Sahara, hippos, rhinos, antelope, elephants, and animals only found far south and east in Africa in modern day. Perhaps the most important and influential art tradition of the Green Sahara is that of the Roundhead period, which has its origin in West Africa amongst the people of Niger. These paintings of the Aqualithic span millennia and give us a key insight into the development of what will become the defining cultural traditions of the African continent. It is here in the Central Sahara, the foundation of much of the cultural practices of much of Sub-Saharan Africa and later Nile Valley civilization will be created. Here in Niger in West Africa, we find one of the great masterpieces of the Aqualithic. This is the Debou's giraffe. This life-sized engraving is 18 feet tall and is the largest petroglyph in the world. If we look, there seems to be a string attached to the neck of the giraffe, suggesting that perhaps these early West Africans domesticated the giraffe. It should be known that the giraffe had a very special significance in early pre-dynastic religions. It is in the Sahara we find the oldest evidence of anyone on Earth taking psychedelics, as we see masked shamans dancing with mushrooms and people seemingly turning into mushrooms, lost in a trance. This use of psychedelics will continue on in later Egyptian cultures. We also see the earliest form of circumcision, a ritual practice shared throughout the African continent. We also see the oldest use of ritual masks, a staple of African cultures. Here on Saharan walls, we see shamans wearing jackal masks, the early precursor to the Anubis masks worn by Egyptian priests. Ritual masks are a regular theme in both Roundhead rock art and modern African cultures. A limited group of men, male relatives of the dead, and their ancestors, male ritual initiates, are permitted to make physical contact with secret masks. Young male initiates receive the spiritual emblem of the stick to denote peace and wisdom. This ritual use of the stick can be seen in later Egyptian statues that depict people's kas or spirits walking into the afterlife. In the Roundhead rock art, we will also see one of the most fundamental parts of all African culture, that being traditional African dance. Over 43% of Roundhead rock art showcases the beauty of traditional African dance. Throughout the Sahara, we see many dancers showing off moves that can still be seen amongst modern West African people. To quote Ngura, "In the aesthetic of West African art, a man in an A pose symbolizes a living man in opposition to a dead man. This pose corresponds also to the starting posture usually assumed at the beginning of a dance, as it shows the infinite expressive potential of the human body." In all Sub-Saharan Africa, a semi-squatted figure will be immediately related to dance, as the underlying posture is attained during the fundamental dance movement known as getting down, common to all African traditional dances. The evident angular postures reached at the acme of this dance move are considered to express an intense change in vigor and move in proximity of the earth, being an evident manifestation of suppleness and physical fitness, translating in a symbol of beauty. The getting down move was made familiar in the Western culture by the Afro-American diaspora.
Closest thing to Jesus Christ, rockin' ice, I'ma give the guy. Can't explain the feeling when I cop that new 650 high. Curving all these hoes, married the paper, bay, I can't reply. Supercharged, the cat tap the gas, all you see is demon fire. Ballin' hard, triple double, T-Mac with the lean and that. Young bitch got no job, she just swipe cars, that hoe be scheming by. Lobster tail for brunch, used to focus on the steaming now. Her daughter now can't stand me. I supply auntie them fiendin' high. Life been kinda good, but mission is there, but this shit bittersweet. Somewhere in the whole spot with two bitches like the middle seat. Wipe my ass with hundreds, I got bills all on the shitter seat. Laws been kinda hot, hit the block, meet me on the middle street. Pain inside my joints, probably need surgery, shots of cortisone. Racks inside the garbage bags, everywhere, a hoarder's home. The standards with the plug, he give me extra, won't be short as on. Green dots for root money in the pen, he talk on cordless phone.
Dance is also used in rituals similar to psychedelics to achieve some altered state, and is often used by shamans to gain insight and to heal the sick. This is most commonly seen amongst the Khoisan. This is not surprising, as the Khoisan lived in the Sahara amongst Nigerians. Today, Khoisan DNA is still found very much within the Igbo people of Nigeria. We also see early examples of scarification, a practice shared between Nigerians, Nubians, and Ethiopians, as well as being found on certain ancient Egyptian mummies. We also see priestesses covered in body paint, a practice also used throughout Africa. She wears a set of bull horns, perhaps a precursor to the goddess Hathor in later Egyptian religion. In the Green Sahara, we also see giant deities painted on very specific rock shelters, reflecting the modern belief amongst many Sub-Saharan cultures in the holiness of certain places, such as high mountains, which gods are said to reside in. This belief system can be later seen amongst the Nubians and the Egyptians, who both revered the mountain Jebel Barkal, both believing that the god Amun dwelt there. Just as the origin of many aspects of African culture can be found in the Central Sahara, perhaps the most recognizable aspect of ancient Egypt can also be found here. In the rock shelters of Uan Mahujaj, we find the oldest mummy in Africa, more than 6,225,000 years old, predating the first mummies in ancient Egypt by 1,000 years. The Tashwanat mummy is the mummy of a small black boy, barely 2 years old. His preparation is extremely sophisticated and shows a pronounced knowledge of surgical techniques. All of his thoracic and abdominal viscera have been removed, and the body placed in a flexed position, head turned to the side, and a preservative had been placed in his abdomen. He had been wrapped in a layer of vegetable fibers, a small necklace of ostrich shells wrapped around his neck. This level of sophistication in the mummification process must have took generations to master, and showcases the genesis of the practice, which would become synonymous with ancient Egyptian civilization. And not surprisingly, till this day, we still find royal mummies from ancient Egypt that are every bit as black as that first mummy from the Green Sahara.
But the CT scan has one more surprise for Alejandro: Shammai's ethnicity. Examining Shammai's anatomy closely, the thickness of his bones and the shape of his nasal cavity, the anthropologists think he was a black African, likely from neighboring Nubia. A huge revelation that challenges the prevailing image of the Egyptian ruling class.
They have just told me that Shammai had Nubian features, which means that their ruling family was probably Nubian, and that was unexpected.
Another key feature of the Aqualithic culture complex is the use of barbed bone harpoons. These harpoon points are found throughout the Sahara, stretching from West Africa to East Africa, and typify the cultures of the Aqualithic. To understand the genesis of this invention, we have to go here, Ishango, Central Africa. The people of Ishango were unique in prehistoric times, as for millennia they had maintained a sedentary lifestyle, living off the rivers and lakes of Central Africa, especially Lake Edward, which is the headwaters of the Nile River. Some 25,000 years ago, the Ishango developed unilateral barbed bone harpoons. This aquatic invention would explode onto the regions of the Aqualithic, becoming the defining technology of the Green Sahara. From Lake Turkana in East Africa to the Nile Valley to the Sahara and to the coasts of West Africa, these unique harpoons would be the go-to subsistence technology for Africans throughout the Aqualithic. But this was not the only technology invented by the Ishango. The Ishango people were the oldest mathematicians on the face of the earth. This ancient community possessed the Ishango bone, the oldest advanced mathematical tool in the world. The Ishango bone is a polished baboon fibula possessing several mathematical equations, the tip of the bone affixed with a sharpened piece of quartz for writing. This advanced mathematical tool being created over 20,000 years ago. This creation belonged to the oldest mathematical tradition on Earth. Far older than the Ishango bone is the Lubumbo bone. Dating back some 45,000 years, it is the oldest mathematical tool on the planet, bearing 29 notches and also made from a baboon fibula. It is the earliest invention of a tally stick, which was used for counting. But the Ishango bone was used for far more than simple counting. It would lay the foundation of advanced mathematics. The tables found along the bone possessing subtraction, addition, multiplication, division problems, as well as possessing the earliest set of prime numbers. The central column shows a number and its double, 3 and 6, 4 and 8, 5 and 10. And the last two, when added, are the divisible by which each row must be divided by. 5 and 7, which equals 12. The right column are additions and subtractions of 10 by 1. 10 plus 1 is 11. 20 plus 1, 21. 20 minus 1, 19. 10 minus 1, 9. The left column shows the prime numbers between 10 and 20. A prime number is a number that can only be divided by itself and 1. Thus 11, 13, 17, and 19. And as I said, the last two numbers of the central column is the sum that each column must be divisible by. 5 plus 7 is 12. When all numbers are added up in the left column, the sum is 60. 60 is divisible by 12 5 times. The central column, when all added up, is 48. 48 is divisible by 12 4 times. And the last column, when all added up, is also 60. 60 is divisible by 12, once again, 5 times. Thus, the Ishango bone showcases the earliest examples of the Dewey Decimal System, or what's known as the base 12 system. It's this base 12 system that will become the foundation of all Egyptian mathematics. It is from the Egyptians we get our conception of timekeeping, of calendars. This is why a minute is 60 seconds, why an hour is 60 minutes, and why there's 12 months in a year. It is this Dewey Decimal System, invented 20,000 years ago in Central Africa, that we use to order our lives to this very day. But it's not only Egypt and Ishango we find the base 12 counting system. We also find it here, in the Cross Rivers region of Nigeria, amongst the Yaskua, Kora, and Ham people, its use dating back thousands of years. As the Ishango people dispersed from their homelands, they brought with them not only barbed bone harpoons, but mathematical knowledge as well. If we look closely at the Ishango bone, it is not only a mathematical tool, The sharp and coarse at its end used for writing. Also, there is a second Ishango bone, confirming that the Ishango people use devices for writing, engraving, and didactics, which is teaching or instructing. Thus, the Ishango bones are both pen and paper, and are living documents. When we read and interpret these mathematical documents from 20,000 years ago, we are reading, making it not only the earliest example of advanced mathematics, but of writing as well. Thus, in Nigeria, we don't only find the same base 12 counting system as in Egypt or Ishango, we find writing as well. In Egypt, the hieroglyphics are called Medu Neger, or the words of God, while the Nigerian hieroglyphics are known as Nsibidi, which is the Igbo word meaning to play. While nowhere near as famous as its Egyptian cousin, Nsibidi is also a logographic script, possessing hundreds and hundreds of symbols. The oldest evidence of Nsibidi is 1,500 years old, and can be seen on early pottery from Calabar. Though its antiquity most likely goes way back farther than that, as Nsibidi is often written down on perishable materials, on calabashes, palm stems. It can be written in the air or in the dirt, and was often written on the body of messengers and sent long distances. It was often used for public notice and also to keep records. To quote MacGregor, "The use of Nsibidi is that of ordinary writing. I have in my possession a copy of the record of a court case from a town on the Inyang Creek, taken down in it, and every detail, except the evidence, is most graphically described. The parties in the case, the witnesses, the dilemma of the chief who tried it, his sending out messengers to call out other chiefs to help him, the finding of the court and the joy of the successful litigants and of their friends are all told by the use of a few strokes. It is also employed for purposes of communication." Literacy of Nsibidi dwindled with colonization in Nigeria, prior to which it used to be taught to children in schools. The most literate in Nsibidi were those members of the Ekpe Leopard Society, who guarded many of the secrets of the ancient script. Similar to the Egyptian priests, the reforms of Nsibidi only practiced by them. There are still many signs that are still not known of. It should be noted that the creation of a writing system is a landmark for any society. The creation of an extensive corpus of symbols that interconnects and that can be interpreted and read is one of the most important developments any society can achieve. For example, all European scripts are derived from an African script, that being ancient Egyptian. In fact, all alphabets are derived from ancient Egyptian, by way of the Phoenicians. One of the most funniest stories is how MacGregor first found out about Nsibidi. He was teaching a class in colonial Nigeria, and was literally telling the Nigerian children how they were primitive because they never invented a writing system, when a boy leaped out angrily and said, "Hey, we have writing? It's called Nsibidi." Think of the irony. An English person who in fact uses an African script in Africa telling them they don't have writing. Of special note is the mythology surrounding the creation of Nsibidi. To quote MacGregor, the way in which the Ugwakime say that they learned Nsibidi is this. In the forests of their country live many large baboons called idiak. If a man is staying in the bush all night and makes a big fire to warm himself or to frighten away wild animals, the idiak will come down from the trees and sit round the fire just like men. When the idiak did this, all men were frightened and ran away, but the Ugwakime were not frightened. Thus there sprang up a friendship between the idiak and the Ugwakime. After a time, the idiak began to write signs on the ground, which the Ugwakime did not understand. At last it was seen that when the idiak traced a sign on the ground and then acted in pantomime, the sign on the ground meant the act performed. These signs the Ugwakime called Nsibidi, which is derived from the Igbo word sibidi, meaning to play, for they had learned these things through the playing of the idiak. The similarities between Egyptian mythology is striking, as in Egypt the god of mathematics and writing is Thoth, who is often depicted as a mischievous baboon. He is also credited as the creator of the 365-day calendar. Thus both the Egyptian and the Nigerian writing systems both have origin myths revolving around wise and magical baboons. Note that the earliest mathematical tool in Africa is a baboon's fibula, the Lubambo bone, and this practice continued for several thousand years throughout the continent. Thus, the origin of both the Egyptian and Nigerian mythologies regarding baboons and mathematics likely have their origin in the ceremonial use of baboon bones for mathematical practices, and in the deeper cultural history of Africa. So, why did the Ishango people leave Central Africa and disperse into the wider communities of the Aqualithic? We know from the archaeology record a volcanic eruption occurred around 9000 BC, Ishango being located near the Virunga volcanic mountain range. It's the eruption of these volcanoes that would cause the Ishango people to abandon their ancestral homes, as they became covered in volcanic ash. Thus, the Ishango people traveled down the river Nile. These events are some of the most important in human history. As the Ishango people migrated into other regions of Africa, they brought with them their barbed bone harpoon technology. For example, one of the first spots they stopped at was Lake Turkana in East Africa, Kenya. This is why we find barbed bone harpoons at an earlier date than we find dotted wavy line pottery. The West African tradition arrived there after the Ishango people had already spread through the region. The Ishango people spread into the Nile Valley and into the Greater Sahara is equivalent to the movement of fire out of Africa, or the bow and arrow. The mathematics created by the Ishango is one of the most pivotal inventions in human history. The Ishango people were not just the first mathematicians, they were the first people to write things down and to teach others. They were the first philosophers in many ways, as the Ishango bone was not used for simple counting. It's the first example of pure mathematics. These are mathematics only for the exploration of reality, and speak to the early genius of these Central Africans, and the genesis of the mathematics of Egypt. The evidence of the Ishango people's spread is not only shown with the abundance of their bone harpoons that are throughout the Aqualithic, but also in the genetics. As we can see here, there are major West African lineages in North Africa, but as we can see a massive chunk of Central African DNA, speaking to the spread of the Ishango people. Now let us turn to the Sudan and the lands of Nubia. First, let us understand the geographical and environmental state of Nubia. Nubia begins here at Aswan, at the First Cataract, including sites like Nabta Playa and Bir Kasaiba, and stretches deep into the Sudan, to Khartoum and the confluence of the Blue and White Nile. It should be noted that during the Aqualithic, the Egyptian side of the Nile Valley is completely uninhabited for thousands of years. For most of the Aqualithic, no one actually lived in Egypt. It was just another river, and during the Aqualithic, there were rivers and lakes everywhere. So while the Sudan is populated for thousands of years, Egypt is not. Upper Egypt will not be occupied till about 4400 BC, when people from the Sudan start filtering back into the Egyptian side of the Nile Valley. It's these early Nubian people that would become the first pharaohs of Egypt, as Upper Egypt is the hub of pharaonic kingship. But before that, the foundation of ancient Egyptian civilization will be laid in the Sudan. Just as we saw several inventions from West Africa and Central Africa in the Sahara that would later become staples of Egyptian civilization, here too in Sudan, a slew of innovations would take place. Like their brothers in Nigeria, the Sudanese were also master boat builders. Here, deep in Sudan, at Khartoum, buried under ancient rubble near shards of ancient dotted wavy line pottery, we find this piece of art, a granite pebble, with the image of a Nile boat. This is the oldest representation of a Nile boat on the Nile Valley, and the oldest depiction of a boat more advanced than a canoe anywhere on Earth, dating back over 8,000 years. The back half of the boat image is in the best state of preservation. A steering system and cabin are situated at the approximate center of the boat. A composite steering system can be discerned with a tiller placed at a greater than 45-degree angle, with a long pole ending in an ovoid blade. Tiller and pole with blade are fixed to the top of the vertical yoke. Boat and steering system design resemble those painted on the walls of the Bedouin huts and pottery jars, and are the genesis of all boating technology in ancient Egypt. To quote Usai and Salvatore, In particular, the image of a steering gear fixed to a vertical pole inserted in the stern upper hull can be found in boat rock engravings from the Abqa region in Sudanese Nubia, and from Akkad, which is south of the Third Cataract on the left bank of the Nile in the northern Dongola Reach. The blades strongly resembled those of the boat of El Kab. This kind of composite helm was still in use on Egyptian ships built during the New Kingdom. The dome-like cabin on the upper hull is also a well-known feature on boat representations dating to the Gerzean and pre-dynastic periods in Egypt and Nubia. The Khartoum Mesolithic boat may be said to represent the end of important coordinated developments in boat design. The specific features of the boat depicted on the rock from the 16D5 site must have been designed earlier in the Nubian Mesolithic. As this approach to hull design, cabin layout, and steering mechanism are found on boats thousands of years later, it had been judged the best possible architecture for small and medium-sized Nile boats during the Khartoum Mesolithic. As the first and best choice in Nile boat nautical architecture, this design persisted in boat-building tradition for several thousand years. Slight modifications would produce either a fishing or cargo boat. Thus, one of the greatest inventions of Egyptian history was created by the Sudanese, and it is those migrants from the Sudan that would bring this technology into ancient Egypt. Another of one of the greatest inventions in the Sudan was the domestication of cattle. This development would not only have far-reaching impact on ancient Egyptian civilization, but Africa as a whole. The oldest remains of wild cattle are found at Afad in Sudan. They are more than 50,000 years old and mark the southernmost boundary of the species. The Sudanese people during the early Holocene were quick to domesticate these native aurochs. The oldest remains we find in Nubia are at the sites of Bir Kasaiba and Napta Playa, as well as El Barga, where we find burials of individuals laid to rest with cattle skulls. Some of the oldest remains and evidence of domestication is also found throughout the Ledi Basin. These early people of the Sudan showed many of the cultural traits shared by their modern pastoral counterparts. At Ledi, we find one of the oldest sculptures on the Nile Valley, a zoomorphic statue of a cow, dating back to the early era of the Green Sahara. These figures of cows are very similar to ones we find in modern day amongst Nilo-Saharan pastoralists. The figure bears a striking resemblance to later West African figures, illustrating how widespread pastoral culture would become. Also in Ledi, we find ancient tools used to bleed cows safely. This practice is still in use today by Nilo-Saharan tribes like the Maasai and the Dinka, who partake in the ritual drinking of blood only on special occasions, their cattle being deeply revered. This connection with their cattle would eventually become a cattle cult. This practice would eventually evolve into the worship of the goddess Hathor. At around 7000 BC, pastoralism quickly spread throughout the Sahara, where it would become a staple for millennia. Elsewhere in Nubia, we find one of the most important sites of the Aqualithic, Napta Playa. The Sudanese people that resided here built in stone like their neighbors in the Sahara and West Africa. We find tumuli graves built in the exact same fashion that's found throughout the Sahara and West Africa. It is here at Napta Playa we will find the earliest examples of astronomy and what would become megalithic Egyptian sculpture. And it is here at Napta we find the earliest forms of black-topped pottery, a style that would become the dominant feature of early Nubia and Upper Egypt in pre-dynastic times.
Fred Wendorf of Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, heads an international team of archaeologists who've been scouring the desert looking for signs of human occupation. In 1974, they located an ancient settlement on the rim of a shallow basin they call Napta Playa. The Sahara was not always parched and arid. Radiocarbon dating reveals that at about 8000 BC, tropical Africa's summer monsoon shifted northward, increasing the rainfall on the desert and allowing seasonal lakes to form. One such lake was Napta Playa. co-leader of the expedition, Rumold Schild of the Polish Academy of Sciences, has discovered a tiny circle of stones, a Stonehenge in miniature, but 2,000 years older. He thinks it was used to predict the coming of the rainy season.
Well, this humble pile of rocks that you see here is actually one of the oldest calendars ever found. This one consisted of a stone ring and two upright stone alignments that I call gates. You can see them here and there, and one of the alignments points to the north, exactly. The other one, though, that you can see in this, going in this direction, points to the position of the sun on the 21st of June. That is the beginning of summer, the beginning of the rain season in this belt of Africa.
The discovery of this calendar circle only hinted at what was to come. Nearby, several unusual stones were also found, arranged in circles marking the location of deep pits. Fred Wendorf thinks they may mark the graves of important people or honor their spirits. Perhaps someone powerful enough to intercede with the gods and bring rain. One of the most imposing objects was found in this pit, perhaps the final resting place of a ruler or a chieftain. At first it looked like an ordinary boulder, but when Wendorf examined it more closely, it turned out to be a primitive sculpture.
We found this very large and carefully shaped stone down in this hole about a meter above the large bedrock outcrop here that's shaped like a mushroom. You can see how carefully it's worked and smoothed on the surfaces, sharp edge, and you can see how they were able to control the length of the piece by making grooves in this face here, which you can see. And then by using a wedge, they were able to strike off the flakes at exactly the points that they wanted to. This is altogether a very impressive piece of stonework, and it may well mark the beginning of Egyptian fascination with working in large stones.
Here, 7,000 years ago, the first crude monuments in Egypt rose from the desert to honor a fallen king and bring order out of chaos. But for the people of Nabta Playa, the sands of time were running out. Around 5000 BC, the summer monsoon began to shift again, this time south. The rains eventually stopped, and oases like Nabta Playa permanently dried up. Forced to abandon the desert, the settlers headed due east, towards the Nile.
But before the Nubians at Nabta Playa and throughout the Sudan would migrate into Egypt, they would develop some of the key cultural elements of Egyptian society. These traditions originate deep in the Sudan and are found throughout the country during the Aqualithic period. This shared culture was known as the primary pastoral community and stretched from El Badari in Upper Egypt to Rabak, deep in Sudan. It is the movement of Sudanese people into Egypt that will spread this cultural milieu. To quote Wingrove et al., it is by charting the spatial and temporal distribution of specific cultural practices focused on the body, its skin and hair, its diverse contents and substances, its emissions and cavities, and its passage between life and death, that the beginning of a distinctly African context for the later prehistory of the Nile Valley may yet come into focus. The beginning of this culture area lies here at El Barga, in Sudan. It is here at Obarga we will find the beginning of the primary pastoral community. The burials here stand as a precursor to the rich imperial tombs of dynastic Egypt. The people were laid to rest with care and with plenty of goods to take with them into the afterlife. At Obarga, we find one of the earliest examples of the cosmetic palette. These polished stone plates were used for ochre and paints to decorate the body. During dynastic Egypt, they would take on a much more ceremonial purpose, being composed of elaborate shapes and becoming historical documents. At Obarga, we also find beautiful polished stone lip plugs. These also can be found later in Badarian graves. We also find gorgeous bracelets made of hippopotamus ivory. These types of bracelets can be later found in pre-dynastic Upper Egyptian graves, as well as A group and Kerma Nubian graves. Ostrich eggshell beads are found fairly frequently among Mesolithic or Neolithic grave goods in the Sudan. This assemblage, made up of nearly 1,000 beads, was found in a female grave near the head. It seems that it was not a necklace, but a hairnet. In one infant burial of the same period, a string of ostrich shells was tied around the waist. At sites in the central Sudan, such as R12, Kadruka, and Gaba, we find the earliest examples of traditional afro combs. These same afro combs can be found in later Badarian sites of Upper Egypt. We also find the oldest versions of the calciform beakers. These beautiful tulip-shaped ceramics typify the Nubian Neolithic and are found abundantly in later Badarian and Akkadian graves. We also find in the Sudan the earliest examples of mace heads, usually buried with males and sometimes children. Like cosmetic palettes, these mace heads would take on a whole nother level of ceremonial significance in dynastic Egypt, such as the scorpion mace head, also used as historic documents. Around 4,400 BC, the people of the Sudan will begin migrating into the Egyptian side of the Nile Valley, becoming the first people to live in Upper Egypt in over 5,000 years. Coined the Badarians after the site of El Badari, these Nubians shared the exact same cultural complex with their peers in the Sudan. In Upper Egypt, we find the exact same grave goods as we found in Nubian: tulip-shaped beakers, Afro-pick combs, black-topped pottery. For centuries, the Sudan and Upper Egypt constituted a single cultural area, known as the primary pastoral community. To quote Vogel, the period when Sub-Saharan Africa was most influential in Egypt was a time when neither Egypt as we understand it culturally, nor the Sahara as we understand it geographically existed. Populations and cultures now found south of the desert roamed far to the north. The culture of Upper Egypt, which became dynastic Egyptian civilization, could fairly be called a Sudanese transplant. Truer words have never been said, and that is the evolution of Upper Egypt. Not surprising, as these people came from the Sudan, we see very African features on the sculptures of the Badarian. This is probably the most well-known Badarian sculpture, and as we can see, it's of a black woman, very wide nasal aperture, almond-shaped eyes, and pronounced prognathism. Both in Badarian and later Akkadian sculptures of Upper Egypt, we see very pronounced African features on the sculpture: tightly coiled afro hair, braids and dreadlocks, very similar to later Egyptian sculptures, and the exact same hairstyles modern black women wear today. But just as Nubia had both a shared pastoral community, they also had a shared pharaonic community. Both Upper Egypt and Nubia participated in the development of royal kingship and the development of writing in ancient Egypt. We see royal inscriptions at both Upper Egypt and Lower Nubia. During the pre-dynastic, for centuries, the kingdom of Pastoral was in fact more powerful than Egypt, and actually ruled over parts of Upper Egypt, their hegemony reaching far into the grasslands of the Sahara, including places like Nabta Playa and Bir Kasaiba. Questol's pharaonic kingship is best illustrated by the Questol incense burner that has a Nubian pharaoh wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. It is important to know that there were several Nubian pharaohs that ruled over Nubia and parts of Upper Egypt during the pre-dynastic. There were several different rulers vying for control of Upper Egypt. During the pre-dynastic period, several different pharaohs ruled over different parts of Upper Egypt. The Nubians of Questol were amongst those pharaohs, and for a while they were the most powerful of them all. Then, at about 3,300 BC, a major climate change took place. Large parts of the Sahara shifted over to the extremely dry and arid climate it has today. resulting in mass migration from people in the Central Sahara into the Nile Valley.
Abandoning their increasingly arid pastures, more and more people from the Sahara had to join their forerunners and follow the trails in search of a secure supply of water. Some headed for the tropical rainforests, which lay to the south and west. Others moved east towards the valley of the River Nile.
These people, who had originally come from Mali and Niger and Nigeria and Chad and the Congo, had been developing culture and science and mathematics and art for millennia. Their migration into the Nile Valley is one of the most pivotal events in world history. The abandonment of the Sahara spelled the end of the Aqualithic cultures, and their movement into the Nile Valley would mark the true beginning of the ancient Egyptian civilization. As these migrants moved towards the Nile, they brought not only culture and technology, but genetics. As we can see, there are major West African lineages throughout North Africa that arrived during the Holocene, followed by East African and Central African, then finally South African. This is also why the West African variant of sickle cell, the Benin haplotype, occurs very commonly in Egypt to this day, at about 80.8%. But these haplotypes aren't only found in modern populations. The Nigerian haplotype was common amongst ancient Egyptian populations. We find pre-dynastic mummies from over 5,000 years ago, dating back to 3,200 BC, with these same sickle cell alleles. Note that this is right around that time that people started migrating in from the Green Sahara. To quote Panzer et al., molecular investigations on ancient Egyptian mummies from the Anthropological and Ethnographic Museum of Turin, Italy, have reported evidence of sickle cell anemia in 3 pre-dynastic mummies, and the evidence of a hemoglobinopathy, possibly thalassemia, in 1 mummy. Additionally, the presence of a brushed skull and extensive bone pathologies characteristic of hemoglobinopathies and thalassemias have been observed. This is also why we find West African Y chromosomes in ancient Egyptian mummies. This is haplogroup E1b1a. It originates in Western Central Africa. It is the dominant haplogroup of Bantu Niger-Congo people, and it is the paternal line of Pharaoh Ramesses III and other royalty like Pintaware. Thus we can see West African people were a part of the founding populations of ancient Egypt. This marked the turning point for Egyptian history. The Questall state, with the loss of its surrounding population, quickly declined. As the Nubians that once lived at Nabta Playa and throughout the eastern Sahara found their way to the rich banks of the Egyptian Nile, Egypt now, with a sizable population, especially in Upper Egypt, could field far larger armies. And with this, Pharaoh Narmer would head north to conquer the unruly provinces of northern Egypt. This is best displayed on the Narmer palette, where we see the Upper Egyptians striding victorious over their northern foes. This marked the unification of Egypt and the beginning of one of the most influential societies in world history, Pharaoh Narmer serving as the first pharaoh of a united Egypt. Thus, we can see Egypt was not the product of some foreign invader. It was a homegrown civilization that sprung from many different regions of Africa over spans of millennia. In many ways, it is not the first civilization of Africa, as for millennia, people dwelled and prospered in the Green Sahara. They had mathematics, they had technology, they had stone building, they had art, and many of the practices that would become commonplace in Egyptian civilization. It was Nigerians who possessed advanced boating technology, like the Dafuna canoe, that sailed into the Sahara and northern Africa and southern Europe and helped repopulate all of these places. It was East Africans that spread down the Red Sea hills into the Nile and into the Levant, helping repopulate all of these areas. It was people from Mali that created ceramic technology and brought it into the Sahara and clear across the Nile Valley and into East Africa. It was people in Niger who created the round head rock art style that would later go on to deeply influence Egyptian art and culture. It was people in the Congo who created mathematics and spread down into the Nile and into the Sahara that would change the history of mankind forever. It was people in the Sudan that developed cattle pastoralism and the Nile boat and astronomy and many of the practices of ancient Egyptian civilization. And it was all of these Africans over the spans of millennia who lived in the Green Sahara, who lived in southern Europe, who lived in the Levant, who lived throughout Southwest Asia, Pakistan, and beyond, who not only created ancient Egypt, but had a hand in every major civilization of the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. It's important to know that during the age of the Green Sahara, no one is white, no one is Caucasian. The people that live in southern Europe are a mixture of African and Aurignacian. The people that live in the Fertile Crescent are indigenous Levantines admixed with Africans, the Natufians, as well as other populations throughout the world. The original populations on the earth are all melanated. They're just types of Africans, and that includes Europe. These were deeply melanated people admixed with African populations from the Green Sahara. The reason people don't look African anymore is because of the Ice Age, or more specifically, people in Central Asia during the Ice Age. They developed a mutation on a gene, and it basically turned off all of their melanin. As those peoples are from the Caucasus, we call them Caucasian. As they moved down into other parts of the world, they brought with them Indo-European languages, as well as that mutation for the absence of melanin. They mostly replaced and subsumed older populations in Europe and the Middle East. This is best described with who lived in Europe during the Neolithic. As we know, primarily West Africans sailed across the Straits of Gibraltar and into southern Europe. There they peacefully mixed with the Aurignacian people that lived in Europe at that time. These people would develop a peaceful matriarchal society. They were farmers and deeply spiritual, and like their cousins in Africa, they built in stone. These are the people that built Stonehenge. So, what happened? Around 3000 BC, the Yamnaya tribe came down from the Caucasus, from Central Asia. These people were not stone builders. These people were not matriarchal. These people were barbarians. They spread like a plague across Europe, the devil on horseback. They killed every single male of the Aurignacian, replacing 90% of the DNA in Britain and deleting all male lineages of the original peoples of Europe. This was the first genocide in human history. This is why people do not look black anymore. As Indo-European languages and peoples spread, it changed the genetic makeup of much of the world. The way people look in Europe and the Middle East today is not their ancestral state at all. But these migrations happened late in the Neolithic, only about 5,000 years ago. By that time, Egypt and Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley civilization were already up and running. This is why when people ask if ancient Egypt was founded by black people, it's always very funny to me. During most of the Neolithic, even Europeans were black. So why doesn't anybody know this stuff? That has to do with European colonialism, especially when we talk about Africa. Some of the greatest monsters in history were European academics in Africa. Guys like Petrie, guys like Reisner, guys like Verlini, guys like Frobenius, guys like Lot. It's these guys and other academics of their ilk that said Great Zimbabwe was not built by black people. Up until the 90s, kids in South Africa had literal history textbooks telling them how it was built by Arabs or Phoenicians. It's these people that said the art and sculpture of Nigeria was actually made by wandering Greeks. And the sophistication of their metallurgy must have been taught to them by the Portuguese. The metal masterpieces of Nigeria are over 1,000 years old. The very concept of the country of Portugal and a Portuguese person didn't even exist when they were made. In fact, the Moors were conquering Europe at the same time many of the masterworks of Nigeria were being made. In fact, the oldest carbon dating for iron technology anywhere in the world is in Nigeria. That's why all the metalwork is so advanced and crazily good. Africans were making carbon steel 2,000 years ago. It's these same guys that literally strapped dynamite to the pyramids in Sudan and blew the tops off. It's these same people that said the Egyptians were white, though the very first Egyptologists, Champollion and Devonne, said they were black Africans. It's these people that rewrote that history and broke the noses off countless statues in Egypt. There are so many paintings in Egypt where just the nose is removed. It is so blatant and crazy. It's these people that came up with the Hamitic hypothesis, perhaps the dumbest thing ever created by anybody, which breaks down into, oh, you got a straight nose? You're white. Only white people have straight noses. Duh. It's these people that used to grind up mummies and literally eat them. They were literal cannibals. They used to have parties called mummy undressing parties. These people literally went into the Sahara, erased paintings that are thousands of years old, then hired teams of artists to fake forgeries so they could say they were Greek. The things Europeans did in Africa are insane. From blowing up pyramids, to defacing statues, to creating insane theories, to erasing paintings, to stealing artifacts. The sheer extent Europeans went to physically destroy African history is staggering. You could make a whole documentary just about that. This is why everyone in the world is in such confusion. They went out of their way to hide one of the greatest epochs in human history. But here's the thing. These guys have been dead for a very long time. Maybe in the past, you could say, oh, I didn't know, they tricked me. But it's 2024. There's no excuse to be ignorant in this day and age. There have been too many good scholars over the last several decades that have painstakingly rewritten all of this bullshit history. Guys like Christopher Ehret, David Wingrove, Basil Davidson, Shomarka Keita, Charles Bonnet, Stuart Tyson Smith. All of these guys have done amazing work to fix a lot of the things people did in the past. This is why ancient Egypt was a pan-African civilization. It's a place where a lot of different Africans migrated into and just continued doing all the things they were doing in the Green Sahara. There was a whole civilization in the Sahara that predates ancient Egypt by thousands of years. Egypt was not the first place with astronomy in Africa. It is not the first place with mummifications in Africa. It was not the first place with mathematics in Africa. It was not the first place with science in Africa. It is predated by millennia of work. And all of this stuff has been known for a long time. Like I said, there's lots of great scholars out there, like Christopher Ehret, like Bruce Williams, and many others. But there's also a lot of not so great scholars that just kind of write out African history. For example, you can read whole papers about pottery amongst the Natufians and how it spread from India all the way into Europe and Greece. But they will never mention that the pottery in Africa is 4,000 years older. And we know that people migrated from Africa into the Levant. They will purposefully just write out African history. And this has been going on for over 100 years. The very idea of talking about Mesopotamia or any Neolithic civilization without mentioning that they all occurred during an out of Africa event is crazy. It really shows the bias of many modern scholars that just ignore the fact that the Green Sahara is even there, bustling with people, with ceramics and mummification and astrology and mathematics and art and stone buildings. For example, it has not got even near the coverage of a place like Göbekli Tepe, which is in fact related to the people in the Green Sahara. You can't talk about Göbekli Tepe without the Natufians. The Natufians are Africans. Even though it's the modern era, a lot of people still have major biases. It's very rare to see a documentary where people are portrayed as they actually looked. Many people have tried to hide this history away, but it hasn't been hidden very well. Anybody can do the research and find out all of this stuff. That's why that thing with Cleopatra was so weird last year. How do people not know where Egyptians are from? It's 2024. I know some of that is from older scholars who intentionally hid all this. Some of it is from modern scholars who have intentionally hid a lot of this stuff. They've kept a lot of people in the dark. Like I said, that one video of Cosmos where the people are portrayed like black people is accurate. But mostly they don't make movies and documentaries that look like that. They still try to paint them as white, painting the Egyptians as white, painting the Mesopotamians as white, even painting early Europeans as white. It's all untrue. It's all not true. But it's so late in the game. You should know they're lying. You should know what's true and what's false at this point in time. If you're an Egyptian, and there's a lot of racist Egyptians, you should know that you have Nigerian ancestors. You have Khoisan ancestors. You have Pygmy ancestors. There are literally tombs and mummies with pygmies who were officials in ancient Egypt. Like, it's crazy. How do people not know this stuff? You have Ethiopian ancestors, and of course you have Sudanese ancestors above everything else. And those are the people that are treated worst in Egypt. It's really a shame. It's crazy.
Egyptians are black. The real Egyptians are black. Because the real Egyptians, they are real Africans. So those people in Lower Egypt, you see in Cairo, Alexandria, and the Falahins area, they were mixed between the Turkish, Mamluks, French, English, Romans. So those people who come to attack Egypt in that time, they couldn't come to Upper Egypt, to the south, which we still have the same color, our dark color or black color. So they couldn't mix with us.
Next question. Okay, what question?
ريين أصليين اللي هم السمر. إنما البيض اللي كلهم. You see, I explained to him about the Nubians and the Egyptians. They were not white. They are black Africans. So he say now, ليه هنا الناس لسه سمر في الصعيد وفي بحري بيض.
بحري دولة مش أصلا مش أساس مصر.
He said the people in Lower Egypt, most of them they are not Egyptians. They are Greeks, Francois.
If I was God, right, and I was going to start the tribulation tomorrow, a lot of people would not pass. Because a lot of people did a lot of terrible things and said a lot of terrible things last year. My God, people just showed how ignorant they really could be. And, you know, that's the end of this video. I shouldn't even have to make this video. Well, I hope this video helped some people, educated some people, enlightened some people, and let them know the true history of the world and the true history of themselves. Thanks for watching. I'm Solomon. See you later.